999 wins. Not one loss. Not one draw. 31 years. 4 countries. 999 men had tried to put his back to the mat. 999 men had failed. On the night he went for 1,000, in front of 100,000 people, with confetti already loaded in the rafters and every newspaper in the country waiting for the outcome, he pointed at a 141-pound man sitting in the front row in a dark suit with his legs crossed and his hands folded in his lap. Come in here. Show these people something real. 12 seconds later, the greatest wrestler alive was on all fours on the canvas with both his legs temporarily non-functional, staring at the floor of his own ring. Bruce Lee had already picked up his jacket, buttoned it, stepped through the ropes, walked back to his seat, and crossed his legs. He picked up the beer he had never opened and held it on his knee. Stay with this story. Because the 12 seconds are not the story. The story is what Bruce saw on the champion's face before any of it began. The single thing he identified in the moment the finger pointed at him that made him stand up when his best friend was telling him to stay seated, and what he did in the final second of those 12 when he could have ended everything and chose to wait instead. Those of you who have been in rooms where the size of the problem was designed to tell you something about the size of your options, who have sat in front of something enormous, something that had been winning for 31 years, something that every reasonable voice around you was saying could not be addressed in the way you were considering addressing it, this story is for you. You know what it costs to stand up when the arithmetic says stay seated. You know the specific quality of the decision that gets made not after deliberation but from something deeper, from the place where the person you have built yourself into makes itself known without asking your permission. Bruce Lee sat in the front row of an arena holding 100,000 people and watched a man who had never lost in 31 years point at him. His friend grabbed his arm. His friend was right about everything he said. The ring, the rules, the referee, the weight differential, the complete absence of any rational reason to stand up. Bruce looked at his friend. Then he uncrossed his legs and stood. He did not stand up because he had calculated that he could win. He stood up because he had read something on the champion's face that told him this was not about winning. And what he read, and what he did with it in 12 seconds in front of 100,000 people, is the thing that none of the newspapers that covered the night the next morning got anywhere close to understanding. It began, the way most of the important evenings of Bruce Lee's life began, in his garage. The garage behind the house on Roscommary Road in Bel Air was not the garage of a film star. It was the garage of an engineer. The wooden Wing Chun dummy occupied the corner nearest the door, bolted to a steel frame that Bruce had welded himself from raw pipe because the commercial frames available in 1967 had not met his specifications, which were precise and non-negotiable. The heavy bag hung from a ceiling beam that Linda had asked him to reinforce after the second bag had torn through the original mount. He had reinforced it that afternoon, measured the load-bearing capacity, and hung the new bag at the exact height his training required. The floor was bare concrete. He trained on concrete because concrete was honest, it did not absorb the cost of mistakes the way wooden floors did not forgive footwork that was less than exact. It was a Friday morning in late October, early enough that the neighborhood was still quiet, the light still the particular gray-blue of a morning that had not yet committed to sun or overcast. Bruce was shirtless, barefoot, standing in front of the wooden dummy. He had been working on the same 3-technique combination for 40 minutes. Left trap, right palm, left elbow. The sequence was not new, it lived deep in the Wing Chun curriculum and had been in his body for 15 years. But he was working on a specific problem within the sequence, the hip shift between the palm strike and the elbow. The shift was visible if you knew where to look, a rotation of approximately 4 degrees that loaded the elbow with the force the palm had already generated, making the elbow the continuation of the palm rather than a separate technique beginning from zero. He was not satisfied with the hip shift. Not because it was wrong, by any external standard it was correct, precise, complete. He was not satisfied because he could feel, in the transmission of force from the palm through the hip into the elbow, a fraction of a second in which the chain was not entirely continuous, in which there was a seam between the two techniques that should not have been there. No one watching would have detected it. The dummy would not have survived the difference. But Bruce felt it, and feeling it meant it was there, and being there meant it would cost him something in the specific context in which it mattered, the close-range engagement where fractions of seconds were not fractions but everything. He repeated the combination. Left trap, right palm, hip shift, left elbow. He felt the seam. He stopped. He stood still for 7 seconds, his right palm resting flat against the dummy's torso. This was a habit that nobody had taught him and that he did not practice consciously, the specific pause between repetitions when his hand remained in contact with the wood as if completing a circuit, as if asking the dummy something in a language that bypassed thought. He began again. He was on the 41st repetition when Linda appeared in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen. She was carrying Brandon on her hip, 2 years old, serious eyes, his father's jaw. The boy was watching Bruce with the specific focused attention of a very young person who does not understand what they are watching but understands that it matters. Lunch is ready. Bruce stopped. He placed his palm flat against the dummy's chest, the gesture that was not a gesture, that was simply the way he ended a session, a contact that meant something he did not have words for. He took the towel from the hook on the wall and wiped his hands. He crossed the concrete floor. He pressed his lips to Brandon's forehead. The boy grabbed his father's ear with one small hand and held it the way small children hold things, with the complete ownership of someone who does not understand property and therefore does not understand limits. Bruce let him hold it. He sat at the kitchen table. Linda had made rice, steamed vegetables with ginger, a small piece of fish grilled simply, a glass of water. The food was precise in the way that everything in their kitchen was precise, not elaborate, not sparse, exactly what was needed. He ate with chopsticks, unhurried, each element of the meal given the same quality of attention he gave to the wooden dummy. The water he drank in 3 slow swallows, not because he was thirsty but because the training had produced a metabolic state that water addressed better than anything else. Brandon sat in his high chair across the table and ate something orange from a small bowl. He kept looking at his father. The ear he had held still had the warmth of small fingers on it. The phone rang at 3 o'clock precisely. The kitchen clock, white face, black hands, bought at a hardware store the week they moved in, always accurate, never decorative, showed the second hand at the top of its arc when the ring began. It was Tommy. Tommy was a stunt coordinator. He had been working the sets of action films in Hollywood for 11 years, which meant he had spent 11 years in the specific position of someone who understood real physical capability professionally because his job required him to make the difference between real capability and performed capability invisible to cameras. He called Bruce occasionally because Bruce was one of 3 people in his acquaintance whose opinion about physical things he trusted completely, and because Bruce watched fighters, wrestlers, boxers, martial artists of any discipline, the way Tommy watched stunt work, with the technical eye of someone who was reading the physics rather than experiencing the spectacle. He had 2 tickets. Front row, center. A wrestling event that evening at the arena. Main event, the record attempt. The champion was going for 1,000 wins. You'll want to see this guy. He's enormous. Not stage enormous. Genuinely enormous. I need you to watch him and tell me what you're seeing. Bruce was quiet for 3 seconds. Long enough that Tommy thought the call had dropped. How big? Tommy told him what he had heard, 310 pounds. Perhaps more. The ring had been reinforced for this match. Another 3 seconds. Fine. The drive took 40 minutes. Tommy talked for 38 of them. He talked about the champion the way people talk about things that frightened them slightly and fascinated them greatly, with a combination of reverence and the specific qualifying language of someone who wanted you to know that they were not naive about what they were describing but who was describing it anyway. He told Bruce about the man in Detroit whose both arms were broken in a single hold. He told Bruce about the challenger in Osaka who was carried out of the arena and did not walk again for 11 months. He described the man's grip, not in general terms, in specific terms, based on accounts from people who had experienced it and from the structural analysis of what had happened to the bodies it had been applied to. Bruce listened. He did not ask questions. He watched the road. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Linda had asked him to drive with both hands since Brandon was born, and he had changed the habit. He was precise about which habits he changed and which he did not. The ones that served his training he maintained as obligations to himself. The ones that cost him nothing and mattered to people he loved he changed as obligations to them. The distinction was clean and consistent. The headlights moved across the lane markers. The city at night outside the window had its own quality, lit and indifferent, the way cities are at night when you are watching them from a moving car and they do not know they are being watched. Tommy said, his record is 999 and 0. Going for the 1,000th tonight. I've never seen anything like the crowds this is pulling. Bruce said nothing. Tommy said, you're not going to say anything? Bruce said, where does he carry the most weight? Tommy blinked. What? His weight distribution. When he stands. Where does his center sit? Tommy thought about this. He had been to 2 of the man's matches. He had never thought about this. He said, I don't know. High, I think. His chest is enormous. Bruce nodded once. He turned his attention back to the road. They parked 3 blocks from the arena in a space on a side street that Bruce had identified from the street map he had consulted before leaving the house. He always identified the parking before arriving. It was a small habit, meaningless in isolation, one of 100 such habits that collectively meant he almost never spent energy on problems he could have solved in advance. They walked. Tommy was still talking. Bruce was watching the arena appear as they rounded a corner, a concrete rectangle lit from outside by floods that turned the stone a warm orange and from inside by the specific light density of 100,000 people generating the body heat and kinetic energy of close confinement. You could hear it from the street, 3 blocks out. Not individual sounds. A frequency, a resonance. The sound of collective anticipation compressed into a space. At the gate, the man with the ticket scanner looked at Bruce for slightly too long. Not recognition. Assessment. A small Chinese man in a dark suit, alone with a large man who matched the demographic the scanner operator was accustomed to seeing at wrestling events. He almost said something. Something about the suit. Something about why are you here? He decided against it. He scanned the ticket. He waved Bruce through. Inside, the noise became physical. The air was hot and thick with the overlapping smells of several thousand people who had been close together for several hours, beer and popcorn and the metallic note underneath everything that Bruce had learned to identify as a combination of industrial cleaning products and the specific chemical signature that large collections of human bodies under stress produced. Their seats were front row, center. 10 feet from the ring. Bruce sat down. Spine straight. Both feet flat on the concrete. His jacket was buttoned, his hands in his lap. He looked at the ring and did what he always did when he was given a new space to study. He measured it. Not with instruments. With his eyes and his knowledge of standard dimensions and his experience of 1,000 training spaces. He calculated the ring's perimeter, the height of the ropes, the distance from the bottom rope to the apron, the distance from the apron to the barricade, the distance from the barricade to his seat. He noted the way the lighting fell, the specific angle that created a slight shadow on the south side of the ring near the corner post, a shadow that would affect how clearly a fighter could read an opponent's weight distribution in that corner. Tommy handed him a beer. Bruce took it. He set it on the concrete floor beside his foot without opening it. He did not think about the beer again until the end of the evening. The lights dimmed for the first match. There were 4 preliminary matches before the main event. Bruce watched all 4 with the quality of attention that people who watched fights for entertainment did not produce. He watched them the way he studied film of his own training sessions, not for the spectacle, for the information. He was reading the grammar of how these men moved, identifying the structural principles that produced the outcomes, cataloging the specific weight transfers and grip mechanics and timing windows that determined the result of each exchange. In the first match, a wrestler caught his opponent in a rear choke hold and drove him down to the canvas. The crowd erupted. Bruce had seen the choke coming 11 seconds before it was applied. He had seen the setup, the 3 preceding techniques that had been designed to position the opponent's head at the specific angle from which the choke was applied. He had watched the opponent walk into each of those 3 techniques without recognizing that they were not attacks but preparations, that the real technique was the 4th one, that the first 3 were a sentence and this was the period. 11 seconds. In Bruce's practical vocabulary, 11 seconds was a lifetime. In the second match, a submission hold was applied to the left shoulder, a specific rotation that took the glenohumeral joint past its range of motion in a controlled progression that gave the opponent the choice to tap before the rotator cuff was compromised. The opponent did not tap in time. The sound reached the front row. Bruce watched the angle of the damaged arm carefully, tracing with his eyes the line from the shoulder socket to the elbow to the wrist, reading the damage like a blueprint. He moved his right thumb slowly across his left palm. Not a nervous gesture. A mapping gesture. He was locating on his own hand the specific structures that had failed in the arm on the canvas 30 feet away, calculating the relationship between the applied angle and the anatomical result, adding the information to the library he had been building for 20 years about what bodies could receive and what they could not. Tommy, on his 3rd beer now, was leaning over with commentary about footwork and positioning. Bruce nodded at each observation. He did not agree or disagree. He was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about the champion's grip. Not in the abstract, in the specific. Tommy had described the accounts of the men who had experienced it, and Bruce had been running those accounts through his understanding of grappling mechanics ever since the car, building a model of what the grip actually was, what structural principle it expressed, where its requirements were and where its vulnerabilities lived. Every grip had a vulnerability. Every hold required specific conditions to function at its designed capacity. The conditions were the grip's strength, and the conditions were also its weakness, because the conditions were specific, and specific things could be addressed specifically. The question was not whether the grip could be overcome. The question was at what point in its application it was most vulnerable to the specific kind of interruption that Bruce's tools were capable of producing. He had been thinking about this for 40 minutes when the lights went out. The darkness lasted 3 seconds. 100,000 people pulled breath simultaneously. The inhale of a stadium was its own kind of sound. not a sound exactly, a pressure change, a movement of air that was felt in the chest before it was registered by the ears. Then the red spotlight. It came from somewhere above and behind the entrance curtain, a single beam of deep red that hit the smoke rolling from beneath the curtain and turned it the color of something on fire. The smoke spread across the entrance ramp in thick rolls that caught the light from below and held it, moving in the specific unhurried way of theatrical smoke but with enough volume to suggest something other than theater. The drum began. 1 beat per second. So low in frequency that it registered in the concrete under their feet before it registered in their ears, a physical vibration that traveled through the structure of the building and through the chairs and through the bodies in the chairs and produced in those bodies the specific involuntary response that low-frequency sound produced in the human autonomic nervous system, a slight acceleration of heart rate, a mild elevation of cortisol, the ancient part of the brain producing ancient responses to ancient signals. The curtain moved. And the champion appeared. Bruce Lee had been in the presence of large men before. He had trained with Jean LaBelle, who was not large by wrestling standards but whose capacity for applied force exceeded his size in ways that had required Bruce to revise his estimates. He had sparred with heavyweight boxers at training facilities in Los Angeles who had the mass and reach that made Bruce's attack angles require specific solutions. He had worked with professional wrestlers on film sets who had the specific mass density combination that serious training over long periods produced. None of them had produced the specific visual impression that the champion produced as he walked through the curtain and into the red light. The champion was 310 pounds distributed across a frame that was 6 feet 4 inches tall, but the distribution was not the distribution of fat or of water weight or of the cosmetic mass that bodybuilding produced. It was functional mass, the mass of muscles that had been doing specific heavy work daily for 31 years, that had been stressed and broken and rebuilt so many times that the cells themselves had restructured around the assumption of extreme load. His neck was a column. His shoulders were a structural element. His chest was the specific shape of something that had been engineered rather than grown, all the angles wrong in the way that only made sense when you understood that the angles were designed for applying force rather than for appearance. He walked down the ramp the way a man walks who has nothing to prove and no one to perform for and has not had either of those things for so long that the absence of performance has become his most distinctive quality. Each step landed with the specific authority of significant weight placed deliberately, the thud of it reaching the front row clearly above the crowd noise. The crowd noise was itself the specific noise of 100,000 people watching something they were afraid of and could not look away from, the particular pitch of collective awe. He entered the ring. The ropes bent inward when he stepped through them, the elastic response of the material to a load it was designed to contain. The canvas gave slightly under his feet and then firmed, the specific compression of the padding material absorbing the initial weight and then distributing it across the board beneath. The ring itself seemed smaller with him in it, not because his size was optical illusion but because his presence was structural. He occupied space the way walls occupied space, as a permanent feature rather than a temporary inhabitant. He stood in the center and raised both fists. The arena became something that it had not been for the previous 2 hours. Not louder, qualitatively different. The sound that 100,000 people produced when they were experiencing the specific combination of admiration and fear that a genuine physical dominant produced was not the same sound as the sound they produced when they were simply enjoying a spectacle. It had a lower register, a more fundamental vibration, something that connected to older parts of the collective nervous system. Bruce Lee looked at his feet. The champion's feet were planted at shoulder width, left foot slightly forward, both knees pointing outward at approximately 12 degrees. Bruce's eyes moved from the feet to the knees to the hips, reading the weight distribution the way a surveyor reads a landscape, not for its beauty but for its geometry. The left foot was carrying more weight than the right. Not dramatically, perhaps 55 to 45 in favor of the left. This was common in right-handed practitioners who had developed a habit of loading the left side as a base for right-handed power applications. The left side became the structural anchor and the right side became the delivery system. The significance of this was specific and immediate. A left-weighted stance produced a right-side vulnerability that was proportional to the weight differential. The right side, being less loaded, was more available for directional change but also less stable against force applied from the outside at the right angle. Not a large vulnerability. Against most opponents, not a relevant one. Against an opponent who was reading it correctly and had the speed to address it before the correction could be made, it was the door. Bruce filed this away. The challenger entered the ring. A good fighter, legitimately built, 36 wins on his record, a jaw that had been constructed over years of absorbing punishment into something that resembled architecture. He had trained for 7 months for this match, had watched tape extensively, had told a reporter that morning that he had found something in the champion's footwork. He had not found the thing Bruce had found in 45 seconds from the front row. The bell rang. The challenger shot low immediately, both arms wrapping the champion's waist, a double-leg takedown attempt, the specific low-and-drive mechanics that were the foundational attack of wrestling against a larger opponent. For half a second, his arms were around the champion's hips. For half a second, he was driving forward. For half a second, the crowd produced the sound of people watching something impossible. Then the champion's hands came down. They came down with the patience of someone who had seen this approach 999 times and had never been in any danger from it and had learned across decades to respond to it with the minimum force required rather than the maximum force available, because the minimum force was more efficient and efficiency across 31 years was how you stayed undamaged. He broke the grip. Left side first, his right hand finding the challenger's left elbow and rotating it outward from the socket's axis in the direction that the joint's range of motion ended, applying perhaps 120 pounds of rotational force to a joint that resisted it with perhaps 80 pounds of structural resistance. The grip broke. Right side next, the mirror operation. The hands came apart. He turned the challenger sideways. The motion was not dramatic. It was the motion of someone redirecting a smaller thing past themselves, the casual application of control that made the word effortless seem like something other than a cliché. The challenger went sideways and his momentum, deprived of its target, carried him forward and down. The champion guided the descent with one hand at the shoulder, not roughly, precisely. He placed the challenger on the canvas the way a carpenter places a piece of wood, deliberately, at the angle the work required. Then he placed his forearm across the challenger's chest. The forearm was roughly the diameter of a standard fence post. The challenger's chest compressed under it. The referee dropped to his knees beside them and began counting. 1, 2, 3. 9 seconds from bell to count. 9 seconds to end a 7-month training camp. 9 seconds to go from 999 to 1,000. The scoreboard above the ring lit up in white numerals that buzzed slightly from the electrical load of the display. 1,000. The confetti dropped from the rafters, red and gold, the champion's colors, preloaded and triggered by a stagehand somewhere above the arena floor who had been waiting for this number for 11 days of sold-out events. The champion stood. He raised both fists. He threw his head back. His mouth was open, not smiling, receiving. The specific quality of a man who has achieved something historic and is taking it in before the management of it begins. Bruce had not moved. Through the 9 seconds, through the counting, through the confetti, he had sat in the same position he had occupied for the previous 2 hours. Spine straight, feet flat, hands in his lap, breathing unchanged. Tommy was on his feet beside him, screaming with the rest of the arena, completely absorbed in the moment. Bruce was watching the champion's face. Behind the raised fists and the thrown-back head and the open mouth, behind the reception of the historic moment's weight, Bruce Lee read something that no one else in the building had the training to find. Hunger. Not satisfaction. Not the completed piece of a man who has finished something important. The specific, particular hunger of a man who has won 1,000 fights and discovered that winning 1,000 fights had not produced what winning was supposed to produce. The hunger of someone who has climbed the mountain and found that the summit is dirt and wind and that the thing he was climbing toward was not at the top. Bruce had seen this before. He had seen it on the faces of tournament champions after their victory ceremonies. He had seen it in the specific quality of the questions that very accomplished practitioners asked after demonstrations, questions that were looking for something that their accomplishment had not provided. He had seen it in the faces of men who had spent decades inside a single system and who, after achieving everything the system had to offer, found that the achievement was not the thing they had been trying to reach. The champion had won 1,000 fights. He was still hungry. And at the moment that hunger was most visible on his face, at the moment between the reception of the historic achievement and the management of its public expression, his eyes dropped from the rafters and the scoreboard and the falling confetti and found the front row. Found one person in the front row. Found the man in the dark suit with the jacket buttoned and the legs crossed and the hands in the lap who was the only person in 100,000 who had not been on his feet for the past 9 seconds. The champion leaned over the ropes. He leaned with the ease of a man for whom the ropes were a threshold below his center of gravity, something he crossed without effort. His eyes were steady, not angry. The calculation had already happened, the decision had already been made, and what remained was the execution of the decision, which required steadiness rather than emotion. He reached for the microphone clipped to the ring post. His hand found it without looking, muscle memory from 100 similar moments in 1,000 matches across 31 years. His fingers closed around the head of the mic with the specific certainty of someone who had done this before in every arena from the one they were standing in to halls the size of this one's locker room. He pointed. One finger. Straight at the man in the front row. I know who you are. His voice through the speakers filled the arena with the immediate authority of a sound system designed for exactly this purpose. I've seen your little shows on television. Your little kicks. Your little tricks. He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was for emphasis. Stand up. Come in here. Show these people something real. The words hit every wall in the arena simultaneously and came back from the walls changed, not the words anymore but their echo, their weight, the specific auditory record of something that had been said and could not be unsaid. 100,000 people heard them and 100,000 heads turned. The turn was not instantaneous. It moved through the arena the way the whisper of a name moves through a crowd, section by section, row by row, the information traveling at the speed of recognition, each cluster of people alerting the cluster nearest to them before realigning their own attention. The small man in the front row. The man in the dark suit with the legs crossed and the unopened beer beside his foot. Tommy grabbed Bruce's arm. His hand closed around Bruce's forearm just above the wrist. His fingers were tight, the involuntary grip of someone whose body was expressing urgency that words were still in transit to. He pulled his face close to Bruce's ear. Don't. He kept his voice low. This is his ring, his rules, his referee. You've got nothing to prove here. Nobody asked you to come. Nobody expects you to do anything. We sit here, we watch, we go home. That's it. That's the right move. Don't. Bruce turned his head. He looked at Tommy. Tommy saw Bruce's eyes and stopped talking. He had known Bruce for 3 years. He had been on film sets with him, had watched him train, had sat across from him in restaurants while Bruce annotated notes and explained principles of force generation with a chopstick on a paper placemat. He had never seen this specific expression on Bruce's face before. It was not anger. It was not excitement. It was not the competitive recognition that one fighter produced in another's face at the moment of challenge. It was something quieter and more settled than any of those things. It was the expression of someone who had read a situation completely and had arrived at a conclusion and had found that the conclusion was not arguable. He uncrossed his legs. He placed the unopened beer on the floor beside his chair with the care of someone returning an object to a shelf. He stood up. 100,000 people were looking at him when he stood. The first 100 nearest him had already recognized him, the name moving outward from them in the specific wave pattern of recognition information spreading through a crowd, not simultaneously, serially, row by row and section by section, each person transmitting what they had received to the people adjacent before redirecting their own attention forward. Bruce Lee. The name traveled through the arena with its own acoustic signature, not announced, whispered, and the accumulated whispers of 100,000 mouths produced a sound that was its own kind of announcement, a rising textural density in the ambient noise that the arena's sound system caught and amplified without intending to. The champion was still leaning on the ropes when the name reached him. He heard it processed with the same steadiness that he had brought to everything since the bell. His grin shifted. Not disappeared, shifted. The way a structure shifts when the load it was designed for arrives and the structure finds that the load is not quite the load it was designed for. He had wanted the challenge. He had made the calculation. Bruce Lee's name was rising, the challenge would be news, and winning the challenge would make the 1,000 wins disappear behind something larger. He had planned for this. He had planned for a man who would approach carefully, who would calculate the odds, who would need to be coaxed or shamed into the ring. Men who were smart enough to be afraid approached carefully. Smart men who were afraid were manageable. He had not planned for a man who stood up without hesitation and walked to the ring with the quality of movement that he was now watching approach across the arena floor. He did not analyze what he was seeing. He felt it. 31 years of competitive dominance had given him a sensory system for threats that operated below the level of conscious analysis, a system built from 1,000 data points of approaching opponents, from the accumulated experience of reading bodies before they could act, from the specific learning that a man who has never lost develops across 3 decades of being the person everyone else was trying to beat. That system said, "This is different." His back foot slid 3 inches across the canvas. Not a step, a slide. Involuntary. The body's response to information that the mind had not yet processed. His left foot moved backward 3 inches and his weight redistributed, and he registered what had happened a full second after it had happened. He looked at his own foot. He looked at Bruce Lee, who was now at the barricade. Nobody else had seen it. 100,000 pairs of eyes watching the small man in the dark suit approaching the ring, nobody watching the champion's feet. Nobody but Bruce, who had been watching the champion's feet since the man walked through the curtain and whose eyes had been on the feet for this entire interaction and who had filed the 3-inch slide into the same place he had filed everything else tonight. The door was there. Bruce placed both palms flat on the ring apron. The apron was canvas over padding, the same material as the ring surface but without the board beneath it, softer and more yielding under his palms. He pressed down and lifted his entire body in a single motion, a movement that required the specific shoulder and core strength he had developed across 15 years of morning conditioning, performed without setup, without visible preparation, the way any movement he had practiced 10,000 times was performed, without announcement. He landed on the apron's edge in a controlled hold, both feet finding the canvas simultaneously, his body already half-turned toward the ropes. He stepped through the ropes and his shoes touched the ring canvas and he was inside. He stood still. The champion was 12 feet away. Between them was nothing except the lit canvas and the 12 feet of air. No referee in position, the ring official was at the side, looking at his supervisor, neither of them finding the relevant provision in the rulebook that covered this specific situation. No bell. No agreed terms. No system of scoring. 2 men. 12 feet of canvas. The largest crowd in the building's history. The specific silence of 100,000 people who had stopped breathing at the same moment without deciding to. Bruce reached for his jacket buttons. He unbuttoned them. All 3. His fingers moved with the same deliberateness they applied to everything, not slowly, not hurriedly, at exactly the pace that the task required. He folded the jacket once, lengthwise, the fold aligned at the center seam. He placed it on the top turnbuckle of the nearest corner, aligning the fold with the post. The jacket was dark and the turnbuckle padding was dark and together they looked like a decision. He rolled his left sleeve. 2 folds, precise, symmetrical, the cuff ending 2 inches below the elbow. He rolled his right sleeve. 2 folds, the same measurement as the left, the same alignment relative to the muscle beneath. The asymmetry between right and left was 0. He had been rolling sleeves for 32 years and the measurement was automatic. He turned. He put his left foot forward and his right foot back. He placed his hands at his sides with the fingers loose and slightly curved and open. He did not raise his hands. He did not take a fighting stance. He did not adopt the ready configuration that 15 years of Wing Chun and 3 years of Jeet Kune Do had given him. He stood the way he stood when he was waiting for someone to finish a sentence. The stance, or the absence of a stance, produced in the fighters watching from the arena's front rows and in the wrestlers sitting in the corners and in the promotional staff standing at the ring's edge the specific physical response that an undefined threat produced in trained people. A cold tightening at the base of the spine. Not fear in the conventional sense, a calibration error, the sensation of a threat assessment system encountering a target it could not categorize. The champion looked at him. His cornermen were behind him. One of them said something that Bruce could not hear but that he could read from the quality of the movement, a hand on the champion's shoulder, a lean toward the ear, the body language of someone offering counsel that they were not certain would be received. The champion's shoulder shrugged the hand off. Not roughly. The shrug of someone who had made a decision and was not revising it. He crouched into his wrestling stance. Low and wide, both hands extended at mid-height, the specific configuration that 31 years had optimized for the grip and drive that had ended 999 matches. His knees bent to the angle his training had established as the optimal balance between explosive capability and structural stability. His weight settled into his hips with the specific heaviness of a foundation. His eyes found Bruce's eyes. Bruce was looking at his feet. The champion spoke into the space between them. His voice did not require the microphone now. The arena was silent enough that normal speech carried, but he projected anyway, the habit of 31 years of speaking to crowds from inside rings. So the little man from the movies wants to play. Bruce did not respond. His eyes moved from the feet to the knees to the hips to the hands. He was finishing the reading he had started from the front row, completing the model of the body across from him, identifying the final details that distance had obscured. The left foot was still carrying more weight than the right. The slide had confirmed what the initial reading had suggested. The left side was the anchor, the right side was the delivery system, and the anchor's primacy in the stance created a specific right side instability that the champion had never needed to address because no one had ever found it in time to use it. Bruce had found it. He had found it 40 minutes ago. The champion dropped the microphone. It hit the canvas and the impact transmitted through the ring structure and through the apron and into the arena floor with the specific thud of a dense object dropped from a height. The sound went through the speakers and came back changed, heavier, final. The showmanship was gone. What was left under it was the thing that had ended 999 men. Not performance. Not calculation. The specific predatory focus of a living thing that has been built by decades of selection for a single purpose, that has survived by being the best at that purpose every time, and that was now applying itself to the next instance of that purpose with the totality of what it was. He moved. 310 pounds launched across 12 feet of canvas. The launch was not the explosive shot of a sprinter, It was the specific motion of a wrestler's entry, the low center of gravity drive that maximized forward momentum while minimizing the target that could be addressed to redirect it. His right hand reached for Bruce's neck. His left hand reached for Bruce's waist. The double grip takedown, the technique that had broken 17 sets of ribs and sent 4 men to hospitals for more than a week and had never once failed to establish the initial control that the subsequent hold required. His hands were moving at the speed that 31 years had developed them to move, which was not the speed of a man trying hard but the speed of something automatic, below conscious management, a body performing a pattern it had performed 999 times before with minor variations of resistance and 0 instances of failure. His hands were 6 inches from Bruce's body when Bruce moved. Not backward. Not sideways. Forward. 1 inch forward into the attack. The movement was smaller than any observer in the front row could have described accurately afterward. Those who tried used words like slight and barely and impossible because their eyes could not isolate what had happened from the surrounding context of everything happening simultaneously. His body had moved forward and to the inside of the champion's right arm, inside, toward the center line, into the space that the reach of the arm created and that the arm could not address once it had passed through. His left hand rose from his hip. It met the inside of the champion's right wrist. Not a block. Not a strike. A touch, the specific quality of contact that Chi-Saw training had built into Bruce Lee's hands across 15 years of daily sensitivity work, the contact that was light enough to receive information and precise enough to redirect force without opposing it. His fingers closed around nothing, because a grip would have created resistance, and resistance would have invited the champion's strength, and inviting the champion's strength was the last thing that was useful here. The touch was a relationship. A contact so brief and so precisely angled that the champion's right hand, traveling at the speed that 31 years had developed it to travel, experienced not an obstruction but a geometry change. The wrist was not stopped. The wrist continued moving at the speed it had been moving at. The direction it was moving had changed by approximately 7 degrees. 7 degrees. The difference between a grip that finds a neck and a grip that closes on air. The champion's right hand arrived at the space where Bruce's neck had been a fraction of a second earlier and found nothing. His fingers closed on the specific nothing that a fist closes on when the target it was built to find is not there. His left hand was still reaching for Bruce's waist. Bruce's right palm met it at the wrist. The contact was the same quality as the right hand interception, not opposition, relationship. A quarter turn of the wrist, clockwise, using the pivot point of the wrist itself to redirect the hand's forward motion through an arc that carried it past Bruce's hip rather than around it. The motion required approximately 6 ounces of applied force. It worked because the champion's left hand was traveling with the full committed momentum of a 310-pound body launching across 12 feet of canvas, and committed momentum required only direction to do work on itself. The champion's own momentum carried him forward and down. Not a throw. Not a technique applied to an opponent. A redirection of a force that had been traveling in a direction that the owner of the force had committed to completely and that had been given a new direction at the moment of its maximum commitment, when reversing it would have required overcoming its own full weight. 310 pounds of committed forward momentum, traveling in a direction that no longer led to a target, arrived at the canvas in the only way that direction and gravity and weight allowed. His right knee hit the canvas first. The impact was the impact of a tree beginning to fall, not the sharp sound of a hard object on a hard surface but the deep resonant thud of significant mass beginning its descent. His left hand found the canvas. His right hand found the canvas. He was on one knee and 2 hands, his upper body still moving forward from the original launch momentum, his base having arrived before his weight was ready to stop. The arena went silent. Not quiet, silent. The specific silence of 100,000 people who had stopped breathing at the same moment. The silence of a crowd that had been producing the specific frequency of collective anticipation for 3 hours and had encountered a result so far outside the range of their anticipation that the cognitive processing required to accommodate it had temporarily suspended all other functions, including the production of sound. The champion came up fast. His training had not left him when his knee had. 310 pounds of 31 years of competitive dominance did not stay on one knee because a technique had found an opening. The engine that had won 999 fights was still running. His hands pushed against the canvas, his legs drove upward, and he was standing again in a time that was genuinely fast for a man of his size, perhaps 2 seconds from contact with the canvas to full standing. His face was red. Not from exertion, from something deeper. The specific red of a face whose owner has experienced something that the owner's entire life architecture had not prepared them to experience. The Thousand Winds had built a specific internal model. I am the thing that happens to others. I am not the thing that happens. That model had just been challenged by the canvas under his knee and the air where his grip should have found a neck. He spun toward Bruce. He threw a right hand. Not a wrestling technique. Not the controlled, precise application of trained grappling mechanics. A punch, a real punch, launched from the shoulder, carrying the full rotation of his upper body behind it, the specific kind of strike that came not from strategy but from the place underneath strategy where shame lived and where the response to shame was the most direct application of force that the body could produce. Bruce tilted his head half an inch to the left. The motion was exactly half an inch. No more. The economy of minimum necessary displacement, the principle that Ip Man had demonstrated on a rooftop in Kowloon in 1954 and that Bruce had spent 15 years integrating until it was structural rather than chosen, automatic rather than deliberate, the default rather than the exception. The champion's fist traveled past Bruce's right ear. Close enough that Bruce felt the specific thermal signature of a large fist moving through air at speed, a brief displacement of the boundary layer, a warmth that was gone before it could be registered as heat. The champion's momentum kept going. His fist kept going. His arm kept going. His shoulder kept going. His body rotated past the midpoint of the punch's arc and kept rotating, the rotational momentum of the committed punch carrying him through a quarter turn before his feet could establish the base to stop it. For one full second, the greatest wrestler alive had his back to Bruce Lee. Bruce was directly behind him. One step away. The specific position from which the finishing technique of a dozen disciplines operated with maximum efficiency. The position from which the engagement ended. He had 7 distinct options. He could name each of them. He could execute each of them in less time than the champion needed to complete the turn. He ran the calculation in the fraction of a second between the champion's back presenting itself and the champion beginning the rotation back. He chose none of them. He chose to wait. This is the moment that the newspapers the next morning missed. This is the moment that the accounts of the witnesses blurred in the retelling because the witnesses had not understood what they were watching in real time and were reconstructing from outcome rather than observation. Bruce Lee could have ended it. He was in the position, at the moment, with the capability. The gap between the technique and its application was zero. What he chose was not zero. What he chose was the opposite of zero, a deliberate fullness, a positive choice to wait, to let the champion complete his turn and face him again, to restore the symmetry of opposition before the next exchange. This was not mercy in the sentimental sense. This was a statement about what the 12 seconds were for. Not to end the champion. Not to take a victory from him. Not to demonstrate capability against incapacity. To answer the question that the hunger on the champion's face had been asking, the question that 999 wins had failed to answer and that the 1000th was failing to answer and that the point made across the ropes at the man in the dark suit had been another attempt to address. The champion turned back. His face was different from the face that had pointed at Bruce from the ring. The showmanship was entirely gone now. The calculation that had produced the pointing, the legacy calculation, the 10,001 calculation, was not available to him in this moment because his body was operating in the specific mode that bodies operated in when they had encountered a fundamental physical surprise and were still processing it. What was left was simpler and more honest than the showmanship or the calculation. It was a man who had never lost, encountering the specific sensation of a body that no longer knew what it was doing. He charged again. Both arms wide, low, the takedown attempt, the technique that had worked 999 times, the thing his body knew how to do better than anything else on the planet, the response of a system that, under extreme uncertainty, defaults to its most rehearsed pattern. Bruce sidestepped one step to the right. His right hand found the champion's left shoulder as the champion passed, not a strike in the force production sense, a contact. Specific contact. The tip of his index and middle fingers pressing together at the convergence of 2 points that Bruce had been locating since he watched the wooden dummy sessions on his own shoulder that morning at 5 o'clock. The acromioclavicular joint and the suprascapular nerve pathway above it, a specific 2 centimeter window where pressure of a specific vector produced a specific neurological response. The pressure was applied for approximately a quarter of a second. The champion's left leg stopped working. Not slowly, not progressively, the connection between the brain's motor instructions and the left leg's muscles was interrupted cleanly, the way a circuit is interrupted, and the left leg became temporarily uninstructed weight. The right leg, receiving the full mass transfer that the left leg was no longer managing, buckled. 310 pounds of committed forward momentum collapsed inward from the left side, the left knee finding the canvas and the right knee following and the hands going down to prevent the face from following them. The champion was on all fours on his own canvas. His arms were shaking slightly from the load of the descent. His breath was coming in the specific rhythm of hard exertion, heavy and controlled in the way that serious conditioning produced, not gasping but working. He stayed there for a moment. Not because he couldn't rise. He was processing. Bruce stepped back. 1 step, 2, 3, the specific 3 steps that created the distance between control and contest, the distance that communicated completion rather than continuation. His hands went to his sleeves. Left sleeve first, he unrolled it, 2 folds down, the cuff returning to the position it had been in before he had rolled it at the ring's edge. Right sleeve next, matching the left, the same 2 folds in the same alignment. He turned. He walked to the corner where his jacket was folded across the turnbuckle. He picked it up, unfolded it, aligning the seam. Slipped his left arm in. Slipped his right arm in. Shrugged his shoulders once to settle the fabric correctly across them. Buttoned the jacket. All 3 buttons, from bottom to top. He stepped through the ropes. He landed on the arena floor without sound, the same economy of descent he had used coming in, nothing wasted, nothing added. He walked back to his seat. The arena was still silent. The silence was not the silence of the moment before the champion's hand had found the champion's foot had come up from the canvas after the 1000th, that silence had been anticipation. This silence was something else. This was the silence of 100,000 people who had watched something that their analytical frameworks did not contain and who were still attempting to build the framework before making the sound that the framework would allow. Bruce sat down. Spine straight. Both feet flat on the concrete floor. He reached down and picked up the beer that had been beside his foot for the entire evening, unopened, slightly warmer than room temperature. He crossed his legs. He held the beer on his knee. In the ring behind him, the champion's cornermen had reached him. They were speaking to him. Their hands were on his shoulders, on his arms, the reassuring and assessing touches of people trying to determine the nature of what had happened while also providing the presence that was required when what had happened was unprecedented. The champion rose. He was steady. His physical capability was undamaged, nothing permanent had been addressed, nothing structural had been compromised. He had spent 31 years building a body for resilience and Bruce Lee had not attacked the resilience. What had been addressed was something thinner and more specific and more fundamental. The understanding of what his body was for. Tommy was staring at Bruce with his mouth open. He had been on his feet for the last 30 seconds without knowing when he had stood up, and he was now sitting in the specific way of someone who has sat down without knowing when they stopped standing, the transition between the 2 states having been managed by some part of his brain that was not currently in communication with the rest of it. He looked at Bruce for a long time. Bruce was looking at the ring. The champion was standing now, his cornermen still close. His face was composed in the way that a face is composed when its owner has decided what they are going to present and is presenting it. Behind the composition, in the specific set of the muscles around his eyes, the quality of his breathing, the way his hands hung at his sides with the fingers more open than they usually were in the ring, behind all of it, the hunger was gone. Not satisfied. Addressed. Whatever question the 1000 winds had been asking, the 12 seconds had given him something that the winds had not. Not an answer, precisely. A different question. A question that pointed somewhere the 1000 winds had not pointed. Tommy finally found his voice. He said, "What was that?" Bruce looked at him. His expression had not changed since before the champion pointed at him. It was the expression of a man who had done something that needed doing and had returned to where he had been before it needed doing. He said, he wasn't looking for a fight. Tommy waited. He was looking for something the winning couldn't give him. Bruce's thumb moved slowly across his left palm, the mapping gesture from the 3rd match. He was hungry in a way that 999 wins hadn't addressed. Tommy looked at the ring. The champion was talking to his trainer. His trainer was saying something emphatic. The champion was nodding with the nod of someone agreeing to something they are not listening to. "What did you do to his leg?" "A nerve," Bruce said. "Temporary. He'll walk normally in 4 minutes." Tommy thought about this. He thought about the fact that Bruce had identified a nerve pathway on a man he had been watching from the front row for 2 hours, had located it during 12 seconds of direct engagement, and had addressed it with 2 fingers pressure for a quarter second. He thought about the fact that this had been less interesting to Bruce than the hungry look on the champion's face before any of it began. He said, "We should probably leave." Bruce uncrossed his legs. He placed the beer on the floor beside the chair. He stood. He looked at the ring one more time. The champion had found Bruce in the crowd. Their eyes met across the arena floor, across the barricade, across the 12 feet of canvas and the rope and the apron that were between them. The champion's expression was not readable to anyone who hadn't spent 15 years studying faces the way Bruce had spent 15 years studying bodies. It was not anger. It was not gratitude. It was the specific expression of someone who has been shown a door they did not know existed and is deciding whether to walk through it. Bruce gave a single small nod. The champion held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked away. They walked back to the car the way they had walked to the arena. Tommy talked for the first 2 blocks. The talking was the specific kind of talking that people produced in the aftermath of an experience they had not processed yet, not describing the experience but circling around it, producing language about adjacent things as a way of staying near the thing they were not yet ready to name. He talked about the press that was going to be generated. He talked about what the wrestling community's response was going to be. He talked about the security implications, the liability questions, the promotional calculations. Bruce walked beside him and said nothing. On the 3rd block, Tommy stopped talking. They walked the last block in the silence of 2 people who had been present for the same thing and who had understood different amounts of it and who knew the amounts were different and had made a mutual agreement, without discussing it, that the difference was acceptable. Bruce drove home with both hands on the wheel. 10 and 2. Linda had left the kitchen light on. The white clock on the wall showed 11:47. The second hand moved in its smooth circle, marking the distance between each moment and the next with the same indifference to what the moments contained that it had always brought to the task. Bruce set his keys on the counter. He poured a glass of water and drank it in 3 slow swallows. He rinsed the glass. He went to the garage. He stood in front of the wooden dummy in the dark for a moment, not turning on the light. Then he went to bed. In the morning, at 4 o'clock, he was in the garage before the light changed. He worked on the hip shift between the palm strike and the elbow. Left trap, right palm, hip shift, left elbow. On the 17th repetition, the seam was gone.